This video is mastered in HDR, and for the best experience, you should watch it in HDR on a television or device with HDR support. So I get a lot of great questions about HDR over email, across my various videos, and through other social media methods. And a lot of them have answers that I think are worth sharing. Hey, I'm Sam with Bill Services. I'm an independent filmmaker, colorist, and expert in video technologies, including high dynamic range video. You all know how Q&As work, so I'm just going to start answering some questions. Nigel Gould Davies asked, should we use the iPhone 12 with FiLMiC Pro? He's asking this because in my original iPhone 12 video, I recommended against using FiLMiC Pro at that time because it hadn't been updated. But today, the answer is yes. The app's been updated to take advantage of HLG and Dolby Vision, and you can toggle just plain HLG or HLG with Dolby Vision metadata in the FiLMiC Pro settings. However, the HLG mode won't add the right colorimetry metadata to the file, so you're better off using the Dolby Vision mode, especially if you plan on bringing your files directly into the Adobe suite. If you're bringing them into Resolve, like I showed in the iPhone 12 video, it doesn't actually matter. The video essence is the same. William Ailman asked, how did you get the Neon 24 calibration chart from Calman? I didn't use Calman to run the calibration on the Neon, only to fine-tune and validate the calibration. The Atomos displays don't support Calman for calibration. I found it really useful to verify the calibration done by any proprietary calibration software by sending it a standard signal from a third-party device to make sure that the calibration worked. My usual method for doing that is to use Calman with a signal generated out of DaVinci Resolve to make sure that the display is reading that standardized signal correctly. Nobody1322 asked, I have a hard time watching anything in HDR. The highlights are too bright, the shadow detail is too dark, the transition between the brights and the darks is too extreme. Is this an issue with OLED, or is this just what HDR is? That's actually a really important question with HDR, and a big problem. It's why Dolby created Dolby Vision IQ, and why HDR10 Plus has added HDR10 Plus Adaptive. The short answer for why this is that the way that we as professionals have been grading our content since forever doesn't always work for HDR. We're used to staring at dim screens in the grading suite that become brighter images on our viewers' screens. We're used to trying to fill the entire dynamic range of the screen we're looking at so the image doesn't feel washed out. And when we grade in HDR, we're usually looking at a smaller master monitor than the large HDR TVs consumers have in their homes. All of these factors contribute to your experience when consuming HDR. With PQ HDR, the dim midtones in the grading suite become dim on the home viewer's screens, well below the brightness values most consumers expect in their content. The home viewer's screens usually don't have the same dynamic range as our master monitors, so the TVs have to adapt the image's highlights and shadow details so that we don't clip or crush them, which can sometimes flatten or wash them out. And on a small screen, a bright backlight or window is an artistic choice, while on a large flat panel screen, it can literally be overwhelmingly blinding. That's why I make some of the recommendations I do to filmmakers planning on distributing in HDR. You do need to adapt your grading styles and modes of thinking for HDR. Dolby Vision IQ and HDR10 Plus Adaptive try to solve some of these problems by standardizing a fix for consumer TVs, but they only exist because we as filmmakers have failed in the medium. There is a good reason for why we did, but that's a lot more history than I have time to talk about here. Hair Hacks and a few others asked, how do you render HDR in Premiere Pro? To export in ProRes from Premiere or Media Encoder, set the format to QuickTime and the codec to Apple ProRes 422HQ or higher. Make sure Render at Maximum Quality is checked, set the output to Rec 2100 PQ or HLG, and change the bit depth to 16. Run your export. To export in HEVC, set the format to HEVC H265, switch to Main 10, and turn on Rec 2020 color primaries, high dynamic range, and include HDR10 metadata. Set your HDR10 metadata and export. From Adobe After Effects, send your compositions to Adobe Media Encoder and follow the AME settings. Using After Effects Render Queue won't include proper HDR metadata in video files. Billy Young noted on my Resolve demo video, the PTCs featuring yourself were so underexposed. That was actually intentional. It's abnormal and wrong to do that intentionally when doing an SDR demo, but it's actually essential to doing any kind of HDR grading demo. The look of the presenter to camera pieces can affect how you as a viewer perceive the actual content, biasing your perception of saturation, exposure, and contrast. The only way to avoid that biasing is to flatten the PTC image and make it grading sweet dark. The rest of the details about why that is are pretty complex with respect to human perception, so it's something that I'll address as part of my future course on advanced grading in HDR. William Ailman asked, the LG C10 supports manual settings on the TV for colorimetry, EOTF, mastering peak, mastering color, max CLL, and max fall, including P3D65 HLG, Rec 2020, among other SDR standards. Could you clarify the reason why your video description sustains that there is no other color space than Rec 709 and Rec 2020? That's actually a really good point. I didn't know about that mode when I made my video. It's not advertised or showcased anywhere by LG. And there's a good reason for that. It's technically a mode designed for engineering and other tests, and not necessarily designed for using in a production environment, and not officially supported. I'm not saying don't use it. I have used it on occasion, and it does seem to be color accurate. But I'm also not sure what it's doing with respect to how it's been calibrated. So it's a big use it if you want? Josh Blackman asked, was there a reason you went for the SmallHD OLED 22 over the Vision 24? Yes, the OLED 22 was released back in 2020. I bought one of the first units and I've been using it to grade in HDR for over 10 months now. The Vision 24 is still only available for pre-order. Chick Schultz asked, when you're changing the colors in HDR, will the noise increase in the clip? Noise is complicated. So the answer is sometimes yes, sometimes no. And it does depend a lot on the kind of noise you're seeing. When you have chromatic noise in an image, you can often make the noise worse by adjusting hues and saturations independent of the other colors. Overall, noise is more of a problem in HDR than it is in SDR because of the way that camera log and exposure tools work. So those shifts do become more of a concern for HDR. I have some tips in my course from Scene to Screen, the HDR image pipeline, on how to minimize noise when shooting for HDR, which you can find at MasterHDRVideo.com. Was Gud asked, why do you use an I/O device for HDR grading when I can hook up my display to a graphics card and I don't need a separate device? This is an important enough question to get its own video. I've already filmed it and it should be released here soon on this channel. Jan S. commented, Rec 2020 is not an HDR color space. Pedantically, that's correct. A color space technically is both a gamut and transfer function, and Rec 2020 uses the BT1886 SDR transfer function. However, most people use the term color space to talk about the color primaries or gamut and not the transfer function. And Rec 2020 uses the exact same color primaries as the Rec 2100 HDR specification. Because that gamut was first defined in Rec 2020, it's usually called the Rec 2020 gamut, and not the Rec 2100 gamut, even when working in HDR. In fact, the HDR10 standard officially defined the color primaries for HDR10 spec as Rec 2020. So functionally, saying Rec 2020 with PQ or Rec 2020 with HLG is identical to saying Rec 2100 PQ or Rec 2100 HLG. Martin Stacy asked, is it possible to use SDR at a display to display HDR content? Yes, but you need to know what you're doing. In fact, it's pretty much how every display or television you use that works in HDR actually works at the panel. The ins and outs of how to make that work involve the optical space and some pretty intense color science, and a deep understanding of how each of the technologies work. So that's not something I'm going to dive into in a Q&A video, though it may end up in a training video or special topic video on MasterHDRVideo at some point. Thank you all for your questions. Keep them coming. I love to answer them. Don't forget to check out my course, From Scene to Screen, the HDR Image Pipeline, to accelerate your learning and creative exploration of the HDR medium, which you can find at MasterHDRVideo.com. Go ahead and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already for more tips, tricks, and tools for working in HDR. And let me know if you have any other questions in the comments below. Until next time, I'm Sam Bilodeau, and I'll see you soon.